The 19th Amendment is one sentence long, and it is a sentence: "You have heard the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Ratified in 1920, which means that for 131 years after the Constitution was written, and for 50 years after the 15th Amendment said the vote could not be denied on account of race, it remained perfectly constitutional for a state to deny the vote to half its adult population for no reason other than that they were women. Not contested, not litigated into being permissible, simply lawful and normal and unremarkable. So the question for this primer is the one that sentence raises and does not answer. If the words are that plain and the principle that obvious, what took 70 years? And there is a second question folded inside it, which is the one this episode is really about. The 19th Amendment is written in exactly the same grammar as the 15th, same structure, same verbs, same prohibition. The 15th had already been on the books for 50 years by 1920, and it had been almost entirely ineffective for most of that time. So what did the drafters expect this one to do differently? This is Do It for the Case Law. Doctrine Deep Dive Season 0, the amendments one at a time, one sharpest gap each. Today, the 19th. Start with the shape of the text because it is doing something specific, and it is worth being precise about what the amendment does not grant women the right to vote. Read it again. The right of citizens shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. It is a prohibition on one particular reason for exclusion. It leaves every other qualification a state might impose completely untouched: residency, age, registration, and at the time it was ratified, poll taxes and literacy tests too. That is the same architecture as the 15th Amendment, which forbids denial on account of race. Neither one confers a right to vote, both remove one specific ground for taking it away. Everything else about who votes remains a matter of state law. It is worth dwelling on why that architecture was chosen, because a different one was available and was argued for. The drafters could have written an affirmative guarantee: every citizen of a certain age shall be entitled to vote. That would have been a national right to vote, enforceable against every qualification a state might impose. It is what many people assume the Constitution says. It does not say that anywhere to this day. There is no affirmative federal right to vote in the text. What exists instead is a series of prohibitions on specific grounds for exclusion, added one at a time across a century and a half: race in 1870, sex in 1920, poll taxes in federal elections in 1964, and age 18 in 1971. 4 amendments, 4 forbidden reasons, and no general right underneath them. And there is a second section, 3 words shy of an afterthought in most tellings. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. That is the same enforcement clause the Reconstruction amendments carry, and it matters for the same reason. A prohibition without an enforcement power is a statement. A prohibition with one is a program. Hold on to that, because the story of the 15th Amendment is the story of an enforcement power that Congress did not seriously use for almost a century. The 19th carries the identical tool. Whether it worked better is the question this episode has to answer honestly. That structure has a consequence worth naming before we go on. If the Constitution forbids particular reasons rather than guaranteeing the franchise, then a state remains free to exclude people for any reason not yet forbidden. And it means that each new exclusion has to be met with a new prohibition, which requires an amendment, which requires 3/4 of the states. So the American approach to voting rights has been reactive by design. Someone identifies a ground of exclusion, a movement forms, decades pass, and eventually that specific ground is forbidden. The next ground is untouched until the next movement. The 19th Amendment is one entry in that sequence. Understanding it as one entry, rather than as the moment women got the vote, is most of the way to understanding what it could and could not do. History is longer than the amendment, and the compression most people carry is misleading. The organized movement is usually dated to 1848, and the convention at Seneca Falls, where a declaration modeled on the Declaration of Independence listed the denial of the franchise among the grievances. That is 72 years before ratification. Most of the women in that room did not live to vote, and the movement was not a single thing moving steadily forward. It split repeatedly and bitterly over questions that have not stopped being difficult: whether to seek the vote state by state or by federal amendment, whether to accept the 15th Amendment's extension of the franchise on account of race without a simultaneous extension on account of sex, and whether to make arguments that appealed to the racial politics of the moment. The state-by-state route also created a legal oddity worth knowing, because it shows how patchwork the franchise was. Before the amendment, a woman's right to vote depended entirely on which side of a state line she lived on and often on what she was voting for. Some states allowed women to vote in presidential elections but not for state office. Others allowed voting in school board elections only on the theory that education was a domestic concern and therefore suitable. Others allowed nothing at all. So the same person with the same citizenship had a different franchise in Wyoming than in Maryland and a different franchise for president than for governor within a single state. That patchwork is what a purely state-level approach produces, and it is a large part of why the federal amendment mattered even after a substantial number of states had already acted. That last one deserves to be said plainly rather than skipped, because it is part of the record. Some suffrage advocates argued for the vote on grounds that were explicitly exclusionary, contending that enfranchising white women would strengthen white political power. Others rejected that framing entirely. Black women organized within the movement and were repeatedly marginalized by it, including being asked to march separately. And the practical consequence outlived the ratification. When the 19th Amendment took effect, black women in much of the South could not vote, for exactly the same reasons black men could not: poll taxes, literacy tests, white primaries, and violence. The amendment removed sex as a permissible ground for exclusion. It did nothing about the machinery already excluding people on other grounds. The state-by-state path came first, and it worked slowly. Wyoming Territory extended the vote to women in 1869 before it was a state. Several western states followed over the following decades. By the time the federal amendment was seriously in play, a meaningful number of states had already acted, and those states sent representatives to Congress who now answered to women voters. That is the mechanism that finally moved the federal question, and it is worth naming because it is a general lesson about constitutional change. The amendment did not pass because the argument was finally made well enough. It passed because enough states had already changed that the national politics changed with them. Congress proposed it in 1919. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify in August of 1920. And then, almost immediately, someone sued to undo it. In 1922, in Lesser v. Garnett, two Maryland citizens challenged the registration of women voters, arguing that the 19th Amendment had not been validly added to the Constitution. Their theory had two parts. First, that the amendment was so large a change to a state's electorate that it destroyed the state's political autonomy, and therefore could not be imposed by amendment without that state's consent. Second, that several of the ratifying legislatures had acted contrary to their own state rules of procedure, so those ratifications should not count. The Supreme Court rejected both, and the reasoning is short and worth having. The Tennessee vote itself is worth 30 seconds because it is the kind of detail that makes the abstraction concrete. The amendment needed 36 states, 35 had ratified, and the count in the Tennessee legislature was deadlocked. A 24-year-old representative named Harry Byrne had been voting against it, wearing a red rose to signal opposition. He had in his pocket a letter from his mother telling him to be a good boy and vote for ratification. He changed his vote. The amendment passed by one and became part of the Constitution. It is a charming story, and it is also a slightly alarming one, because it means the enfranchisement of half the country's adults turned at the final step on a single legislator and a letter from home. Constitutional change is supposed to be hard. It is not supposed to be that narrow. It is also worth noticing what the court did not have to decide because the absence is revealing. Lesser v. Garnett was decided in 1922, less than 2 years after ratification, and it is essentially the last significant Supreme Court case about the 19th Amendment. There is no line of decisions working out what denied or abridged means in this context, no equivalent of the long 15th Amendment jurisprudence about facially neutral devices, no body of doctrine at all. That silence is not neglect, it is the clearest evidence available that the amendment worked. Doctrine accumulates where there is conflict, and conflict accumulates where someone keeps trying. Nobody kept trying. An amendment with almost no case law behind it is either a dead letter or a total success, and you can tell which by asking whether the thing it forbade still happens. On the first argument, the court's answer was structural. The 15th Amendment had made exactly the same kind of change 50 years earlier in the same words, and it had been recognized and enforced for half a century. If an amendment of that character were beyond the amending power, the 15th would have fallen long ago. It had not. On the second, the court held that the ratifying function is a federal function conferred on state legislatures by the Constitution itself and therefore transcends any limitations a state might try to place on it. And it added that where a state officially certified its ratification to the Secretary of State, that certification was conclusive on him and binding on the courts. So the challenge failed on every branch, and the amendment's validity has not seriously been questioned since. Sit with the shape of that case for a moment, because it is doing more work than its length suggests. The court did not defend the 19th Amendment on its merits. It did not say the franchise ought to be extended or that the exclusion had been wrong. It said, in effect, this is the same kind of provision as one we have already accepted. Ratification is a federal function, and the certification is conclusive. That is a decision about the amendment process, not about voting, which is a small and telling fact. The only Supreme Court case most people can name about the 19th Amendment is not about what the amendment means. It is about whether it exists. And that points at the thing this episode is actually about. Compare the two amendments again. The 15th was ratified in 1870 and then almost completely evaded for 95 years, through grandfather clauses and literacy tests and poll taxes and white primaries, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally built enforcement machinery strong enough to matter. The 19th was ratified in 1920 and was, for the large majority of the women it covered, effective more or less immediately. There was no 50-year campaign of facially neutral devices designed to keep women from registering. The exclusion had been explicit, and when the explicit rule was removed, the exclusion largely ended. Why the difference? Not the text, because the text is essentially identical. The answer is that the two exclusions were built differently. Disenfranchisement on account of race had an entire apparatus behind it, decades of law and custom and force devoted to preserving it, and a population with the political power and the will to keep rebuilding that apparatus every time a court struck part of it down. Removing the explicit rule left the apparatus standing. Exclusion on account of sex was, by comparison, doing its work through the explicit rule itself. There was no parallel machinery waiting underneath. Take away the rule and there was not much left to evade with. Same sentence structure, very different results. The difference was never in the amendment. There is a further contrast between the two amendments that the identical grammar hides, and it is about who was doing the excluding. Racial disenfranchisement in the South was concentrated, regional, and defended by state governments acting deliberately and in concert. It had a constituency with the political power to rebuild the apparatus after every legal defeat, and it did exactly that for the better part of a century. Exclusion of women from the franchise was national. It was not the project of a particular region defending a particular settlement. And crucially, it did not have an organized constituency willing to fight a decades-long rearguard campaign to preserve it after the constitutional question was settled. Opposition to suffrage was real and it was serious, but once ratification happened, it largely dissolved rather than going underground. An exclusion nobody is willing to defend covertly is one a prohibition can actually end. That is the sharpest thing this amendment teaches, and it generalizes well past voting. A prohibition removes a stated reason. It does not remove the interest that wanted the reason, and it does not remove any other mechanism that interest can reach for. Whether striking the stated reason actually changes anything depends entirely on how much of the exclusion was load-bearing on that reason, and how much was resting on things the prohibition never touched. So when you read any rights provision, the useful question is not how strong the words are, it is what else is holding this up. If the answer is nothing, a one-sentence prohibition is enough. If the answer is a great deal, then a one-sentence prohibition is the beginning of the work, not the end of it. Which is why the honest account of the 19th Amendment has to hold two things at once. It was genuinely immediately effective for most of the women it covered, in a way the 15th simply was not.
That is a real success, and it should be said plainly. And it was not effective for black women in the South for another 45 years, until the Voting Rights Act reached the machinery that was excluding them on other grounds. Their exclusion was not a failure of the 19th Amendment. It was the 15th Amendment's unfinished work, still unfinished, and the 19th did not and could not touch it. Both of those are true. An account that gives you only the first is a celebration, and an account that gives you only the second is not accurate either.
And it is worth being precise about what immediately effective actually meant in practice, because it was not automatic anywhere. Registration systems had to accommodate roughly twice as many voters. Officials in some places were obstructive. In others, women who registered faced social pressure not to. The amendment took effect in August of 1920, weeks before a presidential election, and turnout among newly eligible voters in that first cycle was well below that of men. None of which is the same as the 15th Amendment's experience. There is a difference between friction that fades over a few election cycles and a purpose-built apparatus that persists for 95 years. But the honest version of effective is that it took a decade or so of ordinary practical adjustment, not that a switch flipped. There's a final thing this amendment is worth holding on to, and it is about how long the work took relative to how simple the sentence is. 72 years from Seneca Falls to Tennessee, 3 generations of organizers, most of whom did not live to see it. State campaigns won and lost and won again, splits inside the movement over strategy and over race that were never fully healed. And at the end of all of it, 29 words. The ratio between the effort and the text is the thing. Constitutional sentences are short, and they read as though they were obvious, and every one of them costs something enormous that the sentence itself does not record. That is worth remembering when a provision seems self-evident. Its obviousness is usually the residue of the fight that made it, and the fight is invisible in the finished text. There is one more thing worth saying about what the amendment did not do, because it shaped the century that followed. The 19th Amendment addressed voting and nothing else. It said nothing about serving on juries, about property and contract rights, about employment, about credit, about whether a married woman had a legal identity separate from her husband. Those were governed by other bodies of law, and they changed, where they changed, on completely separate timelines and by completely separate means. So the amendment that is remembered as the moment of legal equality was, by its own terms, a franchise provision. It removed one ground of exclusion from one activity. Everything else took different fights, and some of them took another 50 years. And that limitation is the reason a further amendment was proposed at all. An equal rights amendment addressing sex discrimination generally, rather than voting specifically, was introduced in Congress within a few years of the 19th Amendment's ratification. It was proposed to the states in 1972 with a ratification deadline attached, and it did not reach the threshold within that window. Its status has been argued over ever since, and those arguments turn on exactly the questions we walked through on the 27th Amendment. Whether a deadline in a proposing clause binds, whether a state may rescind a ratification, and who decides. Those questions remain genuinely open. What is not open is why the amendment was thought necessary. It was necessary because the 19th was about voting. One more comparison because it sharpens the whole episode. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, forbade poll taxes in federal elections. The 26th in 1971 set the voting age at 18. Both are written in the same architecture as the 15th and 19th, a prohibition on one ground, plus an enforcement clause. And both were largely effective almost at once, for the same reason the 19th was. By the time each was ratified, the exclusion it forbade no longer had an entrenched constituency prepared to rebuild it through other means. So across 4 voting amendments written in near-identical language, 1 failed for a century and 3 worked quickly. The variable was never the drafting, it was whether anyone was still fighting. Which leaves a question worth carrying out of this episode. If the effectiveness of a voting rights prohibition depends on whether an organized interest is still willing to work around it, then the durability of any such provision is a fact about politics, not about text. The 15th Amendment did not become effective in 1965 because its words improved. It became effective because Congress finally built machinery that could outpace the people evading it, and because the political cost of open evasion had risen. And machinery can be dismantled, which is exactly what the 15th Amendment episode of this season is about. The words of these 4 amendments have not changed since ratification. What they deliver has changed repeatedly, and it will change again, and the text will not be what decides it. That is the sample. A full Amendment 19 season on this show would take the strands separately, 72 years from Seneca Falls to Tennessee, and the strategic splits along the way, the state-by-state campaigns and how they changed the federal arithmetics, the racial politics inside the movement and the exclusion of black women both from it and from the franchise afterwards, versus Garnett, and what it says about the limits of challenging an amendment's validity, and the long tail of everything the 19th deliberately did not reach. 1 question per episode, each anchored in cases we verify, not cases we remember. A word on how this show works. Everything you just heard is legal and historical education, not legal advice, and the one case in it is real, named, and verified. Le vs. Garnett is a genuine decision of the Supreme Court from 1922, and its holdings on the amending power and on the conclusiveness of a state's certification are described here from the opinion itself, where we summarize rather than quote, we say so. That is the whole ethos, and it is the name of the show. Do it for the case law. I'll see you at the next amendment.